Mr. Commissioner, I've been granted some dispensation from some of my friends in the room. So I think I can do this without encroaching on anyone who hasn't voluntarily offered their time. I have 6 points I'd like to just quickly go to, if I may. And I'd start with tab 3, please, which is a deck which was prepared for the Operations Committee on WSP Strategy for Integrated Planning, June 25th, 2009. Mr. Rao, were you involved in that meeting?
Yes, I was.
May this be marked, please, as the next exhibit?
Exhibit 943.
Mr. Rao, can you tell us, please, what was decided at that meeting on Strategy 4?
Well, just looking through the deck here, there's 3 pieces in it. One was the identification of planning units and what was the appropriate scale. And my recollection was that this approach was generally endorsed, but it wasn't going to be a hard and fast rule. And I think in our document there is a listing of the outcome of this meeting. I saw it somewhere earlier. And then the second was a proposal for establishing priority planning conservation units, the rapid screening process. I think that at that time that this process similarly was had some support but needed more work, is my recollection of it. And the third piece was a work plan update on different aspects that were being undertaken around the region. I think as far as the rapid screening process, and Mark might want to add some more on this as well, is that I think since that time, we've moved on to coming up with an approach to undertake this type of work. There was a workshop that was undertaken, I think it was in the fall of 2009, that was I think it was internal, but anyhow, regardless, I think it was what sort of screening process could be undertaken, and Mr. Holtby presented an idea of how a rapid screening process could be undertaken. And since that time, there's been some more work that Mark, you might want to add some as well.
Is the decision record that you're referring to, Mr. Ryle, at tab 21? That's exhibit 240 for the record.
Yes, that's what I was referring to.
Thank you. Mr. Saunders, or Mr. Rao, one of you could answer the question. There's a reference on page 26 of the Wild Salmon Policy to the that once priority CUs are identified, DFO is to consult with First Nations. Can you describe what consultation DFO has had with First Nations with respect to priority CUs, or steps to establish a process for identifying them?
Well, yeah, there's two parts to your question.
Yes.
So maybe why don't we, if we could address the second one, which is steps of identifying priority CUs, and that was the piece that Mark was going to fill in, and I can come back to talk about some consultation if that's okay.
Okay, Mr. Saunders.
Regarding the identification of a rapid screening approach, I'm not sure it answers entirely your question. But yes, Blair, we have a process to develop a tool to rapidly assess the conservation status, which is not specific, not entirely a match with the benchmarks proposed under the Wild Salmon Policy, but certainly anything under the rapid screening that we determine to be at risk would logically be in the red zone. So Dr. Holtby has been working on an approach to analyzing available data for which we don't have a complete data set for all 400 conservation units, probably roughly 2/3 to 3/4. But the method that he is proposing will be reviewed at our peer review process, CSAS, during this month, and the final document, presuming it receives approval through the peer review process, would be available would be finalized in the fall. So that's a piece around the synoptic assessment. And that would would be part of the informing the priority.
Mr. Riley, you had something to add?
You were asking about what sort of consultations had occurred
Yes.
with First Nations specifically, or just
Yes.
generally?
No, with respect to identifying priority CUs, or the process for identifying them, what consultation with respect to Strategy 4 has gone on with First Nations?
Well, I think what I would refer to is within the IFMP process, there is a chapter. It has moved around in different headings, but regardless, the intent is that there's conservation stocks of concern that are identified in that chapter. And there's been quite a discussion around those stocks that are included in there and what the objectives are. There is also within discussions between Department and First Nations a variety of forums where this occurs. One of the places at a committee that's known as the Conservation and Harvest Planning Committee, where there's discussion around stocks of concern between Department and First Nations. I could also add as well that this is not directly on a bilateral, but through a Tier 3 process through the IHPC, that there's discussion with First Nations as well that are involved. But you had asked specifically around between DFO and First Nations.
Yes, I did. Mr. Commissioner, I think I failed to mark the deck, which is tab 3 in the Commission's Book of Documents for the June 25th, 2009 Ops Committee meeting, and I would ask that.
Yes, you did. That was 9:43.
Thank you. Mr. Young, you've had some questions on the subject of your recommendations arising from the Suzuki Foundation's report returning salmon and integrated planning and wild salmon policy. Do you have any other recommendations specifically related to Strategy 4?
Well, firstly, I'll support Rob Morley's earlier comment that there is a good framework or template, I guess, provided within the wild salmon policy, and I think there's also really clear guidance about the priority or the role of that planning in terms of the objectives it may have. So I think there's a lot of guidance there, and I guess one recommendation would be to revisit those elements and ensure that efforts being undertaken are consistent with them. But I do think the recommendations in that report, as well as the one we published with Watershed Watch, are ones I still support and are fairly comprehensive.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Mr. Morley, from your experience in the Skeena Watershed Initiative, what challenges and lessons do you see for implementing the Strategy 4?
Mr. Commissioner, I actually have several issues and concerns and recommendations coming out of that. And if I may, they relate to the number of planning units that DFO is intending to try to operate here under the policy, and I've seen it change from the initial draft to the published policy talks about 40 to 60 planning units, and I heard earlier this afternoon from the testimony that they're now reducing that down to 20 to 25, but I would suggest that the capacity of the department, again, was in some of those notes, is that under the current way they are going about integrated strategic planning, I don't believe that is at all possible in the next 20 or 25 years for them to accomplish that. I think the way that they have gone about this is doomed to failure and to take much more time and many more resources than anybody has available. And I'll go into the detail in terms of my experience at the Skeena watershed. And part of that, and this is going to go against a fair amount of sort of collective wisdom that seems to be coming from many participants around here, where we're hearing from a lot of people saying that they want to participate at every step of the process in some kind of multi-stakeholder forum. And my experience in the ones I've been in is that whenever you try to establish a multi-stakeholder forum that believes that in some way they are going to influence a long-term strategic plan, that it takes years to get it off the ground, to simply go through the process of deciding on the shape of the table, deciding on representation, deciding on who the members should be, is the group going to be decision-making or advisory only? Should we only have local people, or should we actually allow outsiders into this group? And trying to develop some kind of agenda for going forward takes very, very long time. And even after you've gone through all that, you end up with groups disappearing and new ones arriving, and it just becomes a very difficult process. And to think that you are going to have those kinds of groups involved in even 20 to 25 plans going on in a short period of time, I don't think that there's enough people around with the knowledge and expertise and the interest in this to accomplish that both within and outside the department. I think we need to rethink that approach. And in fact, you are seeing that what happens when you get these groups together, because many of the people are the same people that sit down every year to discuss and argue about annual fishing plans, that you find it very difficult to separate those discussions, and people want to get into the fray of what's actually going to happen this year rather than focusing on what's a long-term strategic plan for either this conservation unit or this group of conservation units. So if you really want to look at the kind of in-depth that sort of planning that's involved, I think the Cultus example is one that's there, that if you have a conservation unit, you really want to look at all of the potential threats to it and all of the potential issues that need to be addressed, and we look at how many people were involved and how long it took through various iterations of committees on Cultus, and we never actually got to step 4 of the wild salmon policy in Cultus. So I just think that we're going at this all wrong, and to a certain extent, my view is that if we want to move forward in this integrated strategic plan, that we need to, in fact, have very focused, largely technical-based teams that would do all of the grunt work in developing the five-step planning process in Appendix 2, and would only seek input from outside people as necessary. And you wouldn't bring together this group to look at alternatives and consequences until you were well down the process. And at that point, they would have some meat to discuss. And I think it would be far more efficient and enable us to actually get to dealing with some plans in a quicker fashion. And so those are really the groups. When you get them together too early, they stumble over steps 1, 2, and 3, and when the technical information isn't in front of them, they get frustrated. We are now in a situation where the Skeena Watershed Initiative is in fact about to fall apart because several groups have withdrawn their participation due to the frustrations of some of the issues I talked about, and First Nations some being at the table, some not being there, whether or not you've got First Nation technical people or political people involved. And it's just the multi-stakeholder process is very difficult, and I think that you need to pick and choose when that kind of group is involved in this process. And frankly, the way DFO is going about it right now, I don't think we'll ever get there.
Thank you. Mr. Morley, if I could just direct you to tab 10. This is my last question. And in particular, just to go to the cover, if I may, Mr. Lund first. Are you familiar with this report? A report of the Skeena Independent Science Review Panel by Walters, Lakatowicz, Peterman, Reynolds.
Yes, Mr. Commissioner, I am.
And I wonder if I could take you to page 90, ringtail number 92, 91 of the document, to the first recommendation of this report. There's a need to confront the major trade-off decisions that are implied by the wild salmon policy and the impacts of mixed stock ocean fisheries on Skeena stocks. There should be an explicit public decision about the loss of biodiversity, number of weak stocks allowed to remain overfished or at risk of extinction that is deemed acceptable, and changes required to fisheries in order to achieve particular harvest objectives. Such a decision should be based on trade-off relationships that can now be estimated from historical data on escapement trends and exploitation rates as shown by the examples provided in this report. Do you agree with that recommendation?
Yes, I certainly do.
Mr. Young?
I partly do. I think that there's a couple key elements here. One is understanding what it means to make a public decision and who that it would involve. I think that would definitely extend well beyond, say, the participants in the Skeena Watershed Initiative or the members of this group, or the people that were involved in it. I think also that we have to be a bit careful about identifying what a trade-off means under the wild salmon policy. I think that the wild salmon policy explicitly identifies conservation units not only for the benefits of salmon, but also essentially to define the minimum unit of diversity that needs to be protected, not just for their ongoing existence, but also to support sustainable use and benefits from them. And therefore, I think the conservation unit actually represents, in some extent, a trade-off where clearly we could manage to a lower level of diversity that would ensure we had salmon in every stream, and there could very well be benefits to that. But that the conservation unit is at a higher level, which I think implies some of those trade-offs, and that it is intended to be the minimum irreplaceable unit of diversity necessary to maintain the long-term sustainability and productivity of salmon. But I, in general, yes, I agree with the point, the recommendation.
Thank you. Then could we mark tab 10, please? Lakatowicz.
Exhibit 944.
Thank you.
Just one quick question, Mr. Rail. Mr. Rail, who is the Operations Committee, and does it still exist?
The Operations Committee, yes, still does exist.
And as with your earlier testimony, is it changing personalities all the time, or is it the same people for?
Well, it's the same positions all the time, which it's chaired by the RDG, and regional directors are members of the Operations Committee. So, but it's the same membership as far as those positions go.
And do I understand correctly, it's all DFO personnel?
It is DFO. It's a DFO committee.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Timberg.
Yes, Mr. Commissioner, Tim Timberg and my colleague Geneva Grande McNeil for Canada. We have 1 hour and 15 minutes, and I note it's 3:30. Mr. Lund, is it possible to get from Canada's list of documents tab 30 up?
Yes, I have an entire folder dedicated to that, so if you know specifically...
30-1. And Mr. Ryle, can you, while we wait for the document to come up, can you describe for the benefit of the Commissioner the work that you commissioned Godfrey Pastel to do with respect to compiling information on wild salmon policy implementation meetings?
Yes, this goes back a few months now. I had become aware from previous discussions through the Cohen inquiry that there was questions about how much consultation had occurred around wild salmon policy in various forms. And while I had some in my possession, I knew that quite a number of other people in the department had their own files, and I thought the best way to figure out just how much consultation had been undertaken around the wild salmon policy was to let a contract to someone to pull all that information together And it wasn't just to answer this as a one-time question. My thinking was that we should really be doing this on an ongoing basis. So who did we meet with, what was discussed, and what material was supplied at those meetings?
All right, and this document before us, this sets out the description of this project that you retained Godfrey Pestle to do?
Yes, that's right. And as noted on here, Amy Marr was part of that, and also in discussion and setting this up between Amy and myself and Deborah Phelan, we put together this project.
And Deborah Phelan's a consultation secretariat?
That's right.
And Amy Marr is in policy?
Amy works in policy branch, yes.
Thank you. And if this, I'll ask that this be marked as the next exhibit, and the following documents under tab 30 be marked consecutively. There's tab 31 through dash tab 30. 30. So it's 30-30. Is that possible?
I'm just going to bring up what I have in front of me,
All right.
which is a little unusual, I know, but I don't have any of these sub-numberings that you're referring to. I have all of these sub-numbers.
Right. Yeah. Oh, okay. So for the clarity of the record, then perhaps what we have prepared, Mr. Commissioner, is one document, which is an Excel spreadsheet that lists all of this information. And we'll just let that one document with the Excel spreadsheets be marked as one exhibit, and I think that will be sufficient.
It'll be Exhibit 945.
And Mr. Ryle, if you could just turn to the tab in front of you, and Mr. Commissioner, to tab 30-2. That's volume 2 of the Green Binder of Canada's. And this is a summary page. And Mr. Lund, you're unable to bring this up then?
I just don't know what document you're referring to.
Okay.
I'm sorry. If you have a description, I might be able to find it.
It's the second Excel sheet. And so we're at tab, it's volume 2 of Canada's binders. Oh yeah, there we go. And so, Mr. Ryle, can you, oh, it's going the wrong direction.
It's a little small.
If we could scroll down, perhaps you could just, let's go to the bottom number first. And what does the meeting days and inventory 516 represent?
Well, Gottfried had collected this information from all sorts of sources within the Department of Fisheries and Oceans at our office in Vancouver and our area offices, Kamloops, Lower Fraser, on the island, and the Secretariat, and et cetera. And the point was to see what sort of discussions had happened around WSP. And I'm not saying that all these meetings that are incorporated within this inventory were solely focused on WSP, but some part thereof was on WSP in consultation. And this represents how many meeting days occurred from what Gottfried pulled together over the time frame we had the contract in place.
And that was the last 5, what was it? Was from 2000 and
2005 until 2000, present. And my view of this is that it's an incomplete number, meaning that there's more meetings than that were captured in this database. And the database doesn't reflect the amount of time that was, put in by staff into developing in preparation for these meetings.
But these
So
are
that's
actual,
not captured.
these are actual meetings with stakeholders or First Nations, where one of the topics was WSP implementation.
That's correct.
And just for the assistance of the participants in the room and the Commissioner, if we could just scroll up, could you just describe what these categories are so people can understand this report a bit, and then I'll move on.
Sure. So under WSP implementation, we had a variety of WSP workshops that occurred in various locations in the province, and the DFO contact is listed there. In this case, it was Amy Marr. The next is the Fraser River Sockeye Spawning Initiative, and that my contact myself. And so that covers the period from, in that case, 2005 to 2009. Multi-interest advisory process, captured integrated harvest planning committee, We did not capture in this case, for example, area harvest committees where there was, I know that there have been meetings that occurred, but that I don't see those reflected here. There's sector-specific engagement, Fraser River Aboriginal Fisheries Secretariat, First Nations Fishery Council, the Upper Fraser Fishery Conservation Alliance, other individual First Nation meetings, the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board, Central Coast Advisory Board, Sport Fishery Advisory Board, meetings with the Marine Conservation Caucus, which says captured under the environmental NGOs, and also at Salmon Enhancement and Habitat Advisory Boards. And then also there's area meetings that occurred as well. So area staff had undertaken these and bilaterals. And as you note, in this case, there's only one identified in this particular section. But I know from myself that more than that occurred just from talking to staff and just because of the duration of the contract, that those are not all incorporated in here.
Because Godfrey could only summarize the ones that he could find minutes of.
Well, given the time frame that we provided for Godfrey and this was over a period of time when we were developing IFMPs and staff where that was a higher priority, is to get that done than to develop this database.
Okay, thank you. So for the assistance of the participants, that's a hyperlink document. They can click on there and then they can find all of the minute meetings. So we've got a complete record of the minutes in the hyperlink. So I'll move on then to a question for you, Mr. Saunders. During the testimony of the predation panel on May 5th, 2011, the Commissioner asked a question of Dr. Ford with respect to a question of science planning. And I'll read out the question and I'll ask if you can perhaps provide an answer to that. I'm trying to get a sense of if this is a scrambled situation in our world of research, or is there actually some game plan here now in 2011 and going forward that takes advantage of all this work that's been done and tries to get a sense for the politicians and bureaucrats and managers, where should they be going forward, where should they be assigning the resources to go forward? So I'm wondering if you could provide the Commissioner with an answer to that question.
Yes, Mr. Commissioner. I think the question can be answered on a couple of different levels around the game plan for science. If we look specifically at the questions that are in front of the Commission and the client in Fraser Sockeye, I think I can explain an overall science process that we've been using within science to address the question. Within the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, starting in 2009, we undertook a process to try to understand what had taken place. And I think
when you say what has taken place, you're referring to?
In terms of the decline in Fraser Sockeye. So as an issue coming in front of the science community, a number of approach was taken to arrive to try to understand the scientific underpinnings of what had taken place. And I think it's fair to say that through the department we engaged about 45 of our staff, scientists with expertise ranging from understanding ocean processes, disease and stock dynamics, and freshwater processes, etc., met to in September of 2009 and established a number of hypotheses that we felt may have been contributing, and have worked since that point, coming back together again we've conducted research, reassigned priorities of staff, and worked with outside organizations to continue a science process to understand what has gone on. I think in terms of our most recent meeting was in April, middle of May, where we again came together to look at the outcome of various projects that we're pulling together. So I think there's an internal approach to allocation of resources, but we also work very closely with the Pacific Salmon Commission in the design of the workshop that was held in June of 2010, which was a major point where we coalesced a lot of and devised an approach to try and assign a weight of scientific evidence that to go along with that. At the same time, we've also been looking at the priorities that we've got within science, and in these areas where there are still questions, started trying to understand what we could be doing, what other research we could be doing, and going in each of the areas of potential influence on Fraser Sockeye, starting to move ahead. I think that would be a specific process that we've been using over the last 2 years within science. I think in terms of a question about how whether there's an overarching assignment of a group or an individual to analyze everything that we're seeing out there. I think the broader scientific process is out there to identify issues as they arise, and then the organization, or I should say actually organizations, science organizations, then react. I can give you examples of that. For instance, you would be familiar with the various papers that are produced, like the grant paper that are doing assessments of the status of stocks, and forecasts. All of those come forward through a Canadian Scientific Advice Secretariat and are in a peer-reviewed process, which the Salmon Subcommittee includes our senior scientists. So anything of interest and concern coming out would be vetted against our scientists, who would say, that may be something we need to explore further. There's an underlying issue here that needs examination. That would come forward through our various processes to influence how decision makers like myself and the other members of the science executive provide resources back to the scientific work that gets done. The Pacific Salmon Commission, we're engaged in that, and I sit, as does Dr. Laura Richards, on a committee for scientific cooperation that makes sure that science is taking action in the case of issues that are developing in front of as we manage the salmon resource. We also produce annually a document called State of the Ocean, where researchers from both the ocean sciences as well as fisheries-related researchers come together with observations about what's being seen in a particular year. And a lot of synergies and understanding of long-term trends get vetted through that and provide the basis for providing priorities going forward. Also, a series of workshops and conferences that will take place within the science community raise these issues both domestically and internationally. So while some of that may sound fairly organic in terms of the way issues come forward, it's fairly effective at bringing forward the key issues. Do we have people, the senior scientists that I referred to earlier, typically Kim Hyatt, who's been in front of this organization, would be of the caliber that would take these overarching observations and start to develop synthesis papers that would go across, start to understand these broader processes that are taking place. We also are working in the context of moving forward on this, the development of new methods that are out there for bringing these very complex issues that are multidisciplinary in nature, such as models that are based on what are called Bayesian belief networks, that are trying to bring together the complexity and allow researchers as well as laypersons to understand how these broader processes are working. So I think we've got, is there a broad plan in terms of one that I can put on the table? No, but there is an approach that's robust enough to bring forward, help understand these complex issues and make sure that the science organization responds appropriately to them.
Mr. Commissioner, I may be wrong, but it appears to me that Mr. Saunders is reading from notes, and it might be easier just to file notes, or perhaps quicker if he simply answered questions from his knowledge.
Perhaps I could address that over the break and get back to you tomorrow morning on that, Mr. Commissioner. Mr. Lund, could we have Exhibit 795, please? And Mr. Saunders, is this the the document you're referring to, the DFO synthesis workshop on the decline of Fraser River sockeye that you just referred to?
That's correct. That's correct.
And who are the, before we move off this topic, who are the senior scientists that lead science in the Pacific region?
Senior scientists, well, there are managers that myself, Denis Demour, who's listed there as the one of the meeting chair. He's the manager for hydrography. Also, Robin Brown heads up ocean sciences, and Dr. Laura Brown is the head of Marine Ecosystems and Aquaculture Division. Ourselves, those 4 division managers report to the Regional Director of Science, Dr. Laura Richards, and we would have the responsibility for ultimately for designing the plan for the ongoing plan and direction for science in the DFO science organization. But there are also, and as you scroll down, you'll see that there are a number of scientists that some of which would have an actual designation as a senior scientist, like Dr. Dick Beamish, who's been in front of this commission, but others that would be like Dr. Mike Bradford, Dr. Terry Beecham, et cetera, that are senior within the science ranks of the department.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner, do you have any questions of Mr. Saunders with respect to science direction?
Well, not at the moment, no.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Ryle, turning to your, some questions for yourself. I've got a series of fairly broad questions regarding implementation of the wild salmon policy. How will the IFMP work under the wild salmon policy when it's fully implemented?
How will the IFMP work under the wild salmon policy?
Yeah.
Well, I think it will work much like it is currently, meaning that within the IFMP we identify stocks of concern, and as I mentioned earlier, some of those are conservation units, not all. Many are groups of stocks of concern, and it will implement harvest management decision rules that will provide protection for those stocks of concern.
And how would it work then, for example, with the Cultus Lake Conservation Unit?
Well, in particular with the Cultus Lake Conservation Unit, it's identified within that chapter that I'm referring to and outlines a limit that would be allowed for exploitation around Cultus Lake sockeye. And where some of those management actions would be implemented within the IFMP. That's been in place now since probably 2004 IFMP. It's not been consistent over the years as far as what the management actions are. They have varied across the years, but the intent is to provide protection to Cultus Lake.
All right, and perhaps then we should turn, Mr. Lund, to tab 28 of Canada's documents. And this is the 2011-2012 IFMP. I don't believe this has been marked as an exhibit yet, so this should be marked, I think.
946.
And if we could turn to page 48 of this document. And so, Mr. Ryle, can you explain then how the IFMP treats the Cultus Lake and late run sockeye?
Yeah, certainly. I should point out too that this IFMP is the normal process is that this is for 2011-2012, but that this has not been formally adopted yet by the department. The minister would approve this, and so
Okay.
but there could be changes to this piece of this document. So in this section, Cultus Lake and late run sockeye, it lays out what the decision rule is to provide protection to Cultus Lake sockeye, and that would be managed within a constraint of the exploitation rate identified for the late run aggregate. As I said, this has not always been a consistent language across the years. It's, as we learn more, the language has changed across the years, and but there's always been a section that included in the annual IFMP to provide direction and protection for Cultus Lake sockeye as far as harvest impacts.
So here, the exploitation rate is proposed at 20%?
Well, it's proposed that the exploitation rate floor identified for late run currently set at 20%, or B, the exploitation rate is consistent with recovery objectives based upon in-season information on returns and potential numbers of effective spawners.
I see.
So one of the big pieces of information around cultus is the pre-spawn mortality, and you go into the season, you make some assumptions about what that level is to decide what sort of exploitation rates.
So that's if next year's run is or this summer's run is low, then you would obviously follow the in-season approach.
Well, the Part B provides some flexibility for some in-season decision-making the way this is worded. So if you have some improved information in season, you might be able to adjust the exploitation rate. But it needs to be consistent with the recovery objectives that are included within the plan. And I think further down in this page, if I'm not mistaken, that those recovery objectives are identified. Might be the next page, actually. So the recovery objectives as outlined in the National Conservation Strategy for Cultus Lake sockeye salmon are as follows, and I won't read them all, but that's what Part B is referring to, that if you're going to make changes in season, they need to be consistent with these objectives.
All right, thank you.
And this is what the recovery team that the Cultus sockeye recovery team drafted, and this is what we've are using as far as, here's what we need to do to protect cultus, and these are the objectives we're going to use.
And what are the complexities involved in operating the IFMP and the wild salmon policy?
I think we've touched on a number of them today, and as the testimony of the panel, and we've talked about the complexities of salmon in general and its biology. To me, the complexities that these fish migrate over great distances, and there's a number of fisheries along the way. So you need to deal with, and all the status of those are not equal all the time, meaning that some could be in the cultus, for example, in a red zone and need to recover, but it's co-migrating with other stocks. And so one of the challenges is what sort of protection are you going to provide to recover that stock, rebuild it, and over what time frame, and what are the implications of undertaking those recovery objectives. Generally, that means if there's other stocks co-migrating, you'll be foregoing that harvest where those mixed stock fisheries occur, and that's been what's happened in recent years, where the harvest rate has generally decreased from historic levels. If we go back a decade or so, where it was 70 to 80%, in more recent years it's ranged anywhere from 20 to 35%, and I'm meaning overall. If you parse that down into some of the management groups, you're going to get even lower amounts.
So that change has been has been happening.
That change has been happening, and those types of changes have impacts on people, and they have impacts obviously on the fish as well, meaning that we're trying to recover these stocks, but they also have impacts on First Nations that want to harvest for FSC, and also people that are recreational and commercial.
So as WSP is implemented, how will DFO deal with weak stocks or priority CUs in mixed stock fisheries?
I think we've been doing that over time, and there's a number of ways of doing that. We have reduced harvest rates, and for the most part, those harvest rate reductions have occurred in marine waters, but they've also occurred in the lower Fraser as well. These stocks are still mixed stock for the most part until they start to migrate further up the Fraser River, and so we've reduced harvest rates. We have set, I think, clear decision rules within the annual IFMP, what those decision rules will be. We have negotiated treaties with the U.S. to minimize their impact, and that's an ongoing challenge. They have a slightly different view than Canada as far as what a wild salmon policy would look like. I don't think they necessarily totally agree with our view of what the conservation units are, but not setting that aside, I think that that's another sort of complexity that one has to deal with. Another country is impacting upon these stocks as well. How
will the WSP impact, if at all, activities of the Fraser Panel and the Pacific Salmon Treaty?
Some of that's a little hard to judge since this is still a work in progress, but it's Canada's responsibilities to provide what the conservation objectives are to the Fraser Panel, and the Fraser Panel then, the bilateral Fraser Panel then implements that and develops an in-season management plan to stay within those. So it's really, it's Canada's obligation to set those conservation objectives, transmit those to the Fraser Panel, and it's up to the Fraser Panel to stay within that. Within the annex that guides the Fraser Panel, it's Annex 4, Chapter 4. There's objectives that are laid out. The first one is conservation, and after that is international, and then domestic is the way it's worded, is my recollection. And so, as it's Canada's obligation to set the conservation objectives, that's the first priority for that panel to meet. Now that means that we need to work with the U.S. to accomplish that, and my view of over the years of when I was on the panel and chairing that panel is I think we have a good working relationship with the U.S., but we don't always see eye to eye on the objectives, but I think that we do have a good working relationship, and the fisheries have been managed appropriately.
Certainty associated with a given return each year. There's this uncertainty as to how many fish will come back.
We still do make pre-season forecasts, and within the 2011-2012 IFMP there are forecasts, and there are two tables actually in the 2011 IFMP. One is that based a forecast on recent productivity, and there's a second table that does it creates a forecast over the long term, and within those forecasts there's probabilities for both those tables. But that's only the pre-season portion of it, and really it's around what you do in season, and we collect a lot of information in season to update those run sizes and manage the fisheries accordingly. And we manage them according to meeting the conservation objectives and First Nations FSE requirements and the allocation policy that Canada has in place currently. Now, typically what happens in season, we also, I would say, start fisheries that have low impact. Harvest some fish, but have generally low impact. So once we're assured that we're going to meet our conservation objectives and put enough fish into the river to meet First Nations requirements, there will be decisions made about the recreational and the commercial fishery, and the commercial fishery on sockeye has a priority over the recreational, but we will commence with some lower impact fisheries, and this has generally been the openings for troll fisheries and gill nets. And we're still collecting information, and after that, other fisheries, purseine, will start that have a higher impact. When I say that, other things that we've been doing in recent years is having demonstration fisheries. So the history has been a competitive fishery where you have open for a duration of time, identify some days or hours that the fishery will open in a particular area. You have some idea of how much will be caught and how many boats will show up and catch that, but that's not an exact science. And one of the things that we've been working on is the demonstration fisheries that have had ITQs, individual transferable quotas, and you can set a quota for the week and go out and harvest that amount that would help to reduce that uncertainty as well as another tool that can be used.
All right. We've run out of time today, Mr. Ryle. We'll continue tomorrow morning with taking you to the IFMP and those descriptions there on the various options.
Hearing is now adjourned for the day, and we'll resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.